There are no quiet days in Maplewood, Minnesota. Even when the sawmill, the heart of this town of 5,000, stops for maintenance, its rhythmic thumping still seems to echo in the ears of the locals. But today, the silence presses on the eardrums with unusual force. The sawmill has indeed stopped, for the first time in 15 years, and not on schedule. At 10:43 a.m. on Tuesday, Robert Campbell, production manager at Maplewood Timber, was found dead near the main sawing machine. The blood, sawdust, and fragments of work clothes presented such a gruesome scene that even Stan Miller, a seasoned paramedic, ran out of the room to get a breath of fresh air. It was an accident, was the official version in the first few hours. According to preliminary estimates, Robert was alone in the shop before the start of the shift, possibly checking the equipment, when something went wrong. The machine's safety mechanisms had been disabled, a gross violation of safety regulations, especially for someone who had established those rules himself. The news spread through Maplewood faster than a forest fire. By noon, everyone knew that Bob Campbell was dead. And by 1 p.m., Sheriff James Hawthorne was standing at the door of the neat two-story house on Oak Street, preparing to tell Elizabeth Campbell that she was a widow. "I need to see for myself," was the first thing Elizabeth said after Jim broke the news to her. Hawthorne tried to dissuade her. What was left of Robert was not something a loving wife should see, but Elizabeth insisted. In the morgue of the county hospital, Elizabeth Campbell stood motionless, staring at her husband's body, covered with a sheet, from under which only his left hand with his wedding ring was visible. The pathologist, Dr. Reynolds, tactfully suggested that the sheet not be removed completely. Elizabeth nodded without saying a word. Her face was pale but dry. "It's definitely him," she said finally. "The tattoo on his wrist is our initials. I drew the sketch myself." Right there in the morgue, Elizabeth cried for the first time. Quietly, without sobbing, just tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Hawthorne put his hand on her shoulder. They weren't just sheriff and town resident. Jim had been Robert's best friend since childhood. Elizabeth pulled away from his touch. "Liz, you need someone to stay with you. I can call Martha," Hawthorne offered. "Yes, please," she replied in that special voice people use when they're in shock. Too even, too calm. Martha Wolfe arrived at the Campbells' house 20 minutes after the sheriff's call. By then, Elizabeth was sitting in the living room, hugging herself, staring blankly ahead. "Oh my God, Liz!" Martha immediately knelt down in front of her friend, taking her cold hands in hers. "Jim told me everything. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Elizabeth replied. "Just sit with me. I can't believe he's gone." For the next 5 hours, the Campbell home became the center of a strange spectacle of grief. Elizabeth, as if awakening from a trance, began to cry with such force and despair that Martha had to call her nurse colleague twice to administer a sedative. She screamed, sobbed, and thrashed about hysterically, calling out Robert's name and cursing the sawmill, the town, and even God himself. Neighbors began to gather at the house, bringing casseroles and pies, traditional offerings of grief in small American towns. Sheriff Hawthorne returned at 3 o'clock to ask a few procedural questions. He found Elizabeth in a state of deep grief, sitting among photographs scattered throughout the living room, clutching her wedding picture to her chest. "He always said he'd die at that damn sawmill," she said through her tears. "I begged him to find another job, especially after that accident with Jenkins last year. But he wouldn't listen. He never listened." At 4:30 in the afternoon, Daniel Price, Robert's assistant at the sawmill, arrived at the Campbells' house. A tall, broad-shouldered man with prematurely graying temples, he looked shaken. "Mrs. Campbell, I don't know what to say. Robert was the best boss I ever had. It's such a tragedy." Elizabeth, her face still swollen from crying, stared at him intently. "Were you there when it happened?" "No, ma'am. I arrived later. Robert usually did the morning rounds himself." "Are you sure it was an accident?" she asked suddenly, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel frowned, searching for the right words. "Why do you ask, Mrs. Campbell?" Sheriff Hawthorne, standing in the doorway, leaned forward, listening intently to the conversation. "Bob would never have turned off the safety guard on the machine," Elizabeth replied. "Never. He was obsessed with safety. After the Jenkins incident, he installed additional safety measures himself. Daniel nodded, but something like concern flashed in his eyes. I understand your confusion, ma'am. I can't explain it either. Sheriff Hawthorne is currently investigating. At 5:43 p.m., exactly 5 hours after Elizabeth learned of her husband's death, something happened that would become the subject of endless speculation in Maplewood. Elizabeth Campbell suddenly stopped crying. She stood up, straightened her shoulders, and in a voice that sounded almost relieved, announced, "Enough of these tears. Bob hated funerals and always said that when he died, he wanted us to celebrate his life, not mourn his death." She turned to the stunned Martha. "Help me organize a party instead of a traditional funeral. Drinks, music, stories about Bob, everything he loved." Martha looked shaken. "Liz, are you sure? Maybe you need some time to rest and collect yourself." "I've never been more sure," Elizabeth replied with unexpected firmness. "This is what Bob would have wanted, and I'm going to do it for him." Sheriff Hawthorne exchanged glances with Daniel Price. Something about the situation bothered them both. "Liz, maybe you should wait until tomorrow to make that decision," Jim suggested cautiously. Elizabeth shook her head, and a strange smile appeared on her face. "Why wait? Life is too short. Haven't we learned that today? The funeral is the day after tomorrow, and I want it to be a celebration, not a wake." At that moment, the phone rang. Martha answered and handed the receiver to Elizabeth. "It's the insurance company," she whispered. Elizabeth took the phone and turned away, speaking in a low voice. When she finished the conversation, her face was impassive. "They're asking for some documents," she said. "Robert took out a substantial life insurance policy last year. I didn't even know about it." Sheriff Hawthorne frowned. "How much, if you don't mind me asking?" $500,000, Elizabeth replied, and the room fell silent again. Martha was the first to break the silence. "That's strange. Bob never mentioned it." "Maybe he wanted it to be a surprise," Elizabeth said. "He always said he would take care of me no matter what." Daniel Price cleared his throat. "Mrs. Campbell, if you need anything from us, from the sawmill, documents or anything else..." "Thank you, Mr. Price. I appreciate it." After Daniel left, Elizabeth turned to Martha. "I need you to help me organize the party. We don't have much time." Martha glanced quickly at Sheriff Hawthorne, who was still standing in the doorway with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Liz, people might not understand. Are you sure you're ready for such an unconventional ceremony?" "I don't care what people think," Elizabeth snapped. "It was Bob's wish, and I'm going to honor it." When Sheriff Hawthorne left the Campbells' house late that evening, he noticed something strange. Elizabeth was standing at the window of her bedroom on the second floor, looking out at the street. She was holding a glass of what looked like whiskey in her hands, and she wasn't crying. She was smiling. The day of Robert Campbell's funeral was unnaturally bright for Maplewood. The sun was blinding, reflecting off the metal fences of St. Joseph's Cemetery, where the townspeople were already gathering. Many looked confused, talking in hushed voices. Instead of the traditional black clothing, bright ties and colorful dresses flashed in the crowd, in accordance with the invitations to celebrate the life of Robert Campbell that had been sent out the day before. "I just can't believe it," Dorothy Lewinsky, the owner of the local bakery, whispered to her friend. "Her husband isn't even in the ground yet, and she's turning the funeral into some kind of party." Elizabeth Campbell appeared accompanied by Martha Wolfe. She was wearing a dark blue dress, not quite mourning attire, but not festive either. She was holding a small urn decorated with wooden elements. Sheriff Hawthorne, dressed in his official uniform, approached Elizabeth. "Liz, are you sure you want to go ahead with this?" he asked quietly. "It's not too late to do things the traditional way." "No, Jim," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Bob always said he wanted to be sent off with a smile, not tears, and I will fulfill his wish." The ceremony began with a short speech by the priest, who clearly felt uncomfortable in this unusual situation. After him, Elizabeth herself took the floor. "Thank you to everyone who came today," she began in a surprisingly strong voice. "Bob was a man who hated gloom and always strove for a life full of joy and laughter. That is why today we will not mourn his death. We will celebrate his life." She placed the urn in a small niche, specially prepared at the cemetery. And now, I invite everyone to our home, where we will remember Bob as he was, full of energy, ambition, and love for life. At the Campbell's house, the tables were laden with snacks and drinks. Soft music played, 80s rock, which, Elizabeth explained, had been Robert's favorite. In one corner of the living room, a screen was set up displaying photos from the deceased's life. In many of them, Robert looked very different from how people in town knew him, a serious manager with a perpetually worried expression. In the photos, he was smiling, hugging Elizabeth, raising glasses with friends. "He really loved life," said one of the guests, looking at the photos. "Only when he wasn't at work," replied another voice. Gradually, under the influence of alcohol and the informal atmosphere, the tension began to ease. People shared their memories of Robert, and the portrait that emerged from these stories was complex and contradictory. "Bob always helped us repair the church roof," recalled an elderly member of the parish council, "for free, just because he wanted to help the community. And remember how he organized a fundraiser for the Johnsons after their house burned down?" added another parishioner. "He raised almost $10,000. Daniel Price, standing off to the side with a glass of whiskey, visibly tensed. "Yes, Robert knew how to be generous," he said, "especially when the whole town was watching." Sheriff Hawthorne, who had been watching with professional interest, immediately turned to Daniel. "What do you mean, Dan?" Daniel took a sip and shrugged. "Nothing in particular, Sheriff. It's just that Robert was a different person in different situations. He could be different with the workers at the sawmill. Different how? Tough, demanding, sometimes even ruthless." At that moment, Elizabeth approached them. Her eyes were clear, with no trace of tears. "What are you gentlemen talking about? I hope you're remembering Bob fondly." "Of course, Mrs. Campbell," Daniel replied quickly. "I was just telling the sheriff what a principled leader your husband was." Elizabeth smiled strangely. "Oh yes, Bob was very principled, especially when it came to his ambitions." Across the room, Martha Wolfe was talking to a group of women from Elizabeth's book club. "What's she really like?" asked Susan Dawson, a teacher at the local school. "All that smiling is a bit weird, isn't it?" Martha took a sip from her glass before answering. "Grief shows itself in different ways," she said diplomatically. "Liz and Bob had a complicated relationship." "Complicated in what way?" Susan asked immediately. "Just complicated," Martha replied curtly. "Excuse me, I need to check on Liz." She headed for the kitchen, but Sheriff Hawthorne intercepted her on the way. "Martha, can I talk to you for a minute?" They stepped out onto the back porch where it was quiet and empty. "Something's going on," Jim said bluntly, "and I think you know more than you're saying." Martha crossed her arms over her chest. "What are you talking about, Jim?" "About Liz acting strange, even for someone in mourning. About Daniel clearly not telling us everything about Robert. And about you just walking away from a conversation about the Campbells' complicated relationship." Martha took a deep breath. "Jim, Robert was your friend, I understand. But you don't know everything." "Then tell me." "I can't. It's not my story." "This is a death investigation, Martha. If you have information—" "Officially, it's an accident," Martha interrupted. "And if Liz didn't want certain things to become public knowledge, I have to respect her wishes. Even if those certain things might have something to do with how Robert died?" Martha paled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Hawthorne replied honestly. "But something's not right here, and I intend to find out what it is." Their conversation was interrupted by the loud clinking of a glass. Elizabeth was calling everyone's attention. "Friends, I'd like to propose a toast to Robert Campbell, husband, friend, colleague, a man who always strived for more." Everyone raised their glasses. Elizabeth continued. "Many of you knew Bob as a reliable, hard-working man, and he was, but he was also a dreamer. He always told me that Maplewood was just the beginning of our journey, that one day we would leave here and start a new, better life." A surprised whisper ran through the room. For most of those present, this information was news. 6 months ago, Bob began negotiations to sell the sawmill to a large corporation, Elizabeth continued. and now the room was completely silent. He believed it would give new impetus to the development of our town. Unfortunately, not everyone shared his vision. She glanced quickly at Daniel Price, who stood frozen with a glass in his hand. "To Robert and his dreams," Elizabeth finished, raising her glass, "which will not die with him." After the toast, many guests approached Elizabeth with questions about the alleged sale of the sawmill. For a town whose economy was completely dependent on this enterprise, such news was potentially explosive. "Liz, why did Bob never mention this at the town council meeting?" asked Maplewood Mayor Harold Fisher. "This affects the entire town." "I think he wanted to wait for a concrete offer before making any public statements," Elizabeth replied. "You know Bob. He's always been cautious about making official announcements." Sheriff Hawthorne watched as Daniel Price quietly slipped out of the room through a side door. He followed him and found Robert's assistant sitting on the porch with a cigarette. "I didn't know you smoked, Dan." "Not usually," Daniel replied, taking a drag. "Only when I'm nervous." "And why are you nervous?" Daniel smiled. "Why are you following me, Sheriff? Am I a suspect?" "Of what?" Hawthorne asked, looking closely at his companion. "Nothing," Daniel replied quickly. "It's just a strange feeling when the sheriff is watching your every move at your boss's wake." "So what's the story with the sawmill sale? Did you know about it?" Daniel stubbed out his cigarette on the porch railing. "Robert never discussed it with me directly, but there were rumors, strange visits from people in suits, secret meetings." "And how did you feel about that?" "What are you getting at, Jim?" Daniel straightened up, looking the sheriff straight in the eye. "You think I would hurt Robert over some potential deal?" "I didn't say that." "But you thought it." Inside the house, the atmosphere was gradually changing. The initial tension was giving way to a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sheriff Hawthorne noticed that some of the sawmill workers, who usually stood at attention in Robert's presence, were now chatting freely and even laughing as they recalled moments from their work. Joe Miller, a loader operator, shared with his colleagues. "Remember how the boss gave Peterson a dressing down for being 5 minutes late? And that was after the guy had spent the whole night in the hospital with his kid." "Yeah, Bob could be a real tyrant," agreed another worker. "Especially in the last few months. It was like something was eating him up inside." Elizabeth, who was passing by, stopped when she heard the conversation. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Was Bob under pressure at work?" The workers fell silent, clearly embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Campbell," Joe finally said. "We didn't mean to speak ill of Mr. Campbell, especially today." "It's all right," Elizabeth assured them. "I want to know the truth. The whole truth." "Well, to be honest, Bob hasn't been himself lately. Nervous, quick-tempered. He was strict before, but now it's like he's waiting for something bad to happen." When the guests began to leave, it was almost 10 o'clock. Robert Campbell's celebration of life left many with a strange aftertaste, a mixture of unspoken words and unease. Sheriff Hawthorne lingered longer than the others, helping to clear away empty glasses and plates. "Unusual funeral," he said to Elizabeth when they were almost alone. "People in town will be talking about this for a long time." "Let them talk," Elizabeth replied wearily. Bob always loved being the center of attention. "Even after death?" Elizabeth looked at the sheriff with an unreadable expression. "Especially after death, Jim. He would have relished all this drama." Hawthorne set the stack of plates on the kitchen table. "Elizabeth, as a longtime friend of Robert's, I have to ask. Everything that was said today about the problems at the sawmill, about his strange behavior in recent months, did you know about that?" "Partly," she replied after a pause. "Bob didn't like to discuss work at home, but I noticed that he had changed. He was more tense, sometimes irritable." "Did he mention any threats, problems, conflicts?" "Jim," Elizabeth looked intently at the sheriff. "Why are you asking these questions? The investigation is closed, right? An accident." "Technically, yes," Hawthorne replied cautiously. "But some details are bothering me." "What details?" "For example, the fact that the safety mechanisms were disabled. Robert would never have done that, and you said so yourself. And then there was the strange phone call he made to me the day before he died." Elizabeth froze. "A phone call? What phone call?" "Bob called me late at night and said we needed to talk urgently. something about serious violations and evidence. We agreed to meet the next day, but the meeting never took place, Elizabeth finished for him. Exactly. And now I'm wondering, what violations and evidence was Robert talking about? And is there a connection between that phone call and what happened the next morning? And Elizabeth stared at the sheriff for a long time, then slowly said, I don't know, Jim. I really don't. But if you decide to dig deeper, maybe you should start with the sawmill's financial records. Bob said something about them shortly before the accident. Do you think there might be something important there? I don't know, but Bob was very concerned. When the sheriff finally left, only Elizabeth and Martha remained in the house. Do you really think Jim will investigate further? Martha asked, pouring them both a glass of wine. Elizabeth nodded. He's not the type to leave questions unanswered, especially when it comes to his friend. What are you going to do? What I have to do, Elizabeth replied simply. Move on. She walked over to the window and looked out at the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of the sawmill were flashing. Even on the day of their manager's funeral, the business continued to operate. You know what's strange, Martha? I feel free, for the first time in many years. Martha looked at her friend intently. Liz, be careful with words like that. People might misunderstand. You're right. Elizabeth turned away from the window. By the way, did you see Daniel at the end of the evening? He disappeared so suddenly. He said he had to get back to the sawmill, something urgent. On Robert's funeral day? That's strange. Maybe he just wanted to avoid more questions from the sheriff, Martha suggested. Daniel seemed nervous all evening. Yes, I noticed, Elizabeth said thoughtfully. I wonder what's bothering him so much. That night, lying in the bed she had recently shared with her husband, Elizabeth Campbell couldn't sleep for a long time. She thought about Robert, his ambitions and plans, about the sawmill and the $500,000 insurance policy, about the workers who talked about him as a tyrant, about Daniel Price, who knew more than he let on, and about Sheriff Hawthorne, who wouldn't rest until he got to the bottom of the truth. The truth. Such an ambiguous and dangerous thing. At one point, she almost dozed off, but the sound of the phone woke her up. Sleepily reaching for the receiver, Elizabeth answered, Hello? We need to meet, said the voice on the other end. Tomorrow. It's about Robert and what he found in the accounting books. Who is this? Elizabeth asked, now fully awake. A friend, the voice replied. Or at least not an enemy. Tomorrow at noon at the old boathouse. And the line went dead. The old boathouse on the shore of Pine Lake had been abandoned for 10 years. After the city council built a modern yacht club on the North Shore, the wooden structure with peeling paint gradually fell into disrepair. But it was here, at noon sharp, that Elizabeth Campbell was waiting to meet the mysterious caller. She chose a spot with a good view, sitting on a bench by the water, but so that she could see all the approaches to the station. It was a cold morning, and Elizabeth wrapped herself in a warm scarf, glancing nervously at her watch. At 12:05, a figure emerged from the woods, a man in a work jacket and cap. As he approached, Elizabeth recognized Tom Jenkins, the lumberyard worker Robert had mentioned in connection with last year's accident. Mrs. Campbell, Tom nodded, keeping his distance. Thank you for coming. Was that you who called me yesterday? Elizabeth asked. Yes, I'm sorry for calling so late and for being so secretive, but I didn't want us to be seen together, especially now. Why? Tom looked around before continuing. Because what I'm about to tell you could be dangerous, for both of us. Elizabeth frowned. I'm listening. Your husband, shortly before his death, he discovered something in the sawmill's financial records, something that worried him greatly. He came to see me about a week ago and asked about the accident that happened to me. Why you? Elizabeth asked. Because my accident wasn't an accident, Tom said quietly. I was working the night shift, checking inventory in the warehouse. I stumbled across some boxes with markings that shouldn't have been there. New equipment that was listed as purchased and installed, but was actually sitting there unpacked. And the next day, my accident happened. A heavy load fell and I miraculously survived. After that, I took compensation and sick leave. I stayed away from the sawmill. Elizabeth looked at Tom intently. And you don't think it was a coincidence? I know it wasn't, Tom said firmly. And your husband seemed to understand that too. He started digging, checking documents, something to do with that equipment and the sale of the sawmill. What's the connection between the equipment and the sale? I'm not sure, but Robert was very upset when he spoke to me. He said the numbers didn't add up, that someone was systematically overcharging for equipment that wasn't actually being installed, but resold. Who? Elizabeth asked bluntly. Tom shook his head. I don't know, but Robert seemed to have figured it out. He said he was gathering evidence and was going to talk to the sheriff. He did call the sheriff the night before he died, Elizabeth said slowly. And the next morning he was found dead, Tom finished, with his security systems disabled, which was completely out of character for Robert. He was obsessed with security. Elizabeth was silent, thinking about what she had heard. Why are you telling me this and not Sheriff Hawthorne? She finally asked. Because I don't know who I can trust, Tom replied honestly. There's a lot of money involved in this scheme, and I'm not sure the sheriff... Jim would never be part of something like that, Elizabeth objected sharply. He and Robert were friends since childhood. Maybe, Tom said uncertainly, but I prefer to err on the side of caution, and I advise you to do the same. Elizabeth stood up from the bench. Thank you for the information, Mr. Jenkins. I'll think about what to do with it. Be careful, Mrs. Campbell, Tom said seriously. If Robert was killed because of what he found out, you could be in danger too. Sheriff James Hawthorne sat in his office, spreading out photographs from the scene of Robert Campbell's death. Something about the pictures bothered him, some detail that eluded his attention. There was a knock at the door, and Deputy Mike Donovan entered the office. Boss, I checked Robert Campbell's phone calls for the week before he died, like you asked. And? Lots of calls to the sawmill, home, usual local numbers. But there's one interesting one. 3 calls to the Blue Ridge Group office in St. Paul. Blue Ridge Group? What's that? A large investment company. They specialize in industrial assets, including sawmills. Hawthorne tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. So Liz was right. Bob was really negotiating to sell the sawmill. Looks like it. Donovan nodded. I also checked his bank statements. Nothing unusual except for a cash withdrawal of $10,000 2 weeks before his death. $10,000? Why would he need that much cash? Maybe some personal expenses? The deputy suggested. Or maybe a bribe or payment for information, Hawthorne said thoughtfully. Mike, I need you to check something else. Request the sawmill's financial statements for the last year. Pay particular attention to equipment purchases. That could take some time, boss. We'll need a warrant. Then get one, Hawthorne said firmly. I want to know what's going on there. After meeting with Tom Jenkins, Elizabeth decided to stop by her bookshop, the Reading Corner, which she hadn't opened since Robert's death. The small space on Main Street, with its cozy armchairs and the smell of old books, had always been her refuge. As she entered the shop, she noticed a note slipped under the door. Unfolding it, Elizabeth read, I'm very sorry for your loss, but maybe it's for the best. He wasn't a good man, a well-wisher. Elizabeth froze with the note in her hands. Who could have left such a message? And what exactly did this well-wisher know about Robert? She slowly walked through the store, mechanically rearranging the books on the shelves. Her thoughts revolved around everything she had learned in the last few days. The financial shenanigans at the sawmill, Robert's plans to sell the business, his call to the sheriff the day before his death. A phone call interrupted her thoughts. It was Martha. Liz, where are you? I stopped by your house. At the store, I decided to air out the place a little. Listen, I need to talk to you. It's important. Did something happen? Not over the phone. Martha's voice sounded tense. Can I come over in 15 minutes? Sure. Martha arrived even earlier than she had promised. Her usually neat hairstyle was disheveled, and her eyes were filled with worry. Liz, Sheriff Hawthorne is investigating Robert's death. Officially, it's still an accident, but he's requested a warrant to check the sawmill's financial records. How do you know? From Linda, the secretary at the sheriff's office. She's my cousin, remember? Liz, what's going on? Do you know something? Elizabeth hesitated, but then decided to confide in her friend. I met with Tom Jenkins today. He believes that last year's accident wasn't an accident, and that Robert's death wasn't either. Martha paled. What do you mean? It seems Robert discovered some financial shenanigans at the sawmill. Something to do with equipment purchases that were actually being resold. And you think that's why he was killed? Martha asked incredulously. I don't know what to think, Elizabeth replied honestly, but there are too many strange coincidences. Martha sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. My God, Liz, if this is true, you have to tell the sheriff. I know, but first I want to figure it out for myself, to understand who could have been involved in these shenanigans. Do you have any suspicions? Elizabeth thought for a moment. Daniel Price was acting very strangely at the wake, and he was in charge of purchasing equipment while Robert was away. Daniel? Martha was surprised, but he always seemed so reliable. Appearances can be deceiving, Elizabeth said bitterly. I know better than anyone that people aren't always what they seem. Martha looked closely at her friend. Liz, we've never talked about this directly, but what was your marriage to Robert really like? Elizabeth turned away, looking out the window at the people passing by. In a small town, everyone knew each other, or thought they did. Robert was a complicated man, she finally said. In public, he was generous, charming, respected by everyone. At home, he was completely different. Did he hurt you? Martha asked cautiously. Not physically, if that's what you mean. He was too smart for that kind of overt violence. But emotionally, yes, constantly. Control, manipulation, gaslighting. He undermined my self-confidence for years, isolated me from my friends. Even this shop, my only outlet, he tried to use against me, constantly reminding me that it was a money-losing venture, that I was wasting my time. Liz, why didn't you ever talk about this? Who would have believed me? Elizabeth smiled bitterly. Robert Campbell, model citizen of Maplewood, against his failed wife with her silly hobby. And besides, in small towns, it's not done to air your dirty laundry in public. Martha reached out and squeezed her friend's hand. I'm so sorry, Liz. I should have noticed. It's not your fault. Robert was a master at creating illusions. And that's why you looked so... liberated? Elizabeth finished for her. Yes, and I hate myself for feeling that way, but I can't deny it. For the first time in years, I can breathe freely. Liz, you have to be careful. If the town finds out how you really felt about Robert... I know, Elizabeth nodded. Especially if his death wasn't an accident. I'll be the prime suspect. In the office of Maplewood Timber, Daniel Price feverishly searched through the documents on Robert's computer. As acting manager, he had access to his late boss's work files, but what he was looking for was well hidden. What are you doing here, Dan? A voice came from the door. Daniel jumped and turned around. Sheriff Hawthorne was standing in the doorway. Jim, you scared me. Just trying to sort through the things Robert left behind. Lots of unfinished projects. Like what? Hawthorne asked, walking into the office. Well, those sales negotiations Elizabeth mentioned. I can't find any specific documents, just a few letters from Blue Ridge Group. Interesting, said Hawthorne, sitting down on the edge of the desk. What about the financial reports, especially the ones related to equipment purchases? Daniel tensed. What about them? Just curious. Robert mentioned some problems with documentation in our last conversation. Really? Daniel tried to sound casual, but his voice faltered slightly. He didn't say anything like that to me. That's strange. He seemed very concerned. Well, you know Robert. He was a perfectionist to the core. He could get worked up over the slightest inaccuracy. Hawthorne nodded slowly. Yes, I knew Robert well. That's why I'm surprised that someone so obsessed with safety could make such a fatal mistake as disabling the safety mechanisms. He was probably in a hurry. Daniel shrugged. He wanted to check something before his shift started. Maybe, Hawthorne agreed, keeping his eyes on Daniel. By the way, I have a warrant to check the sawmill's financial records for the last year. I hope you'll cooperate. Of course, Daniel replied too quickly. Anything you need. But may I ask why? If it's an accident, standard procedure, Hawthorne said evenly. Especially when it involves a key business in town. When the sheriff left, Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead and took out his phone. He dialed the number and looked around nervously before speaking. We have a problem. The sheriff is digging into the sawmill's finances. He has a warrant. No, I don't know what he knows. Yes, I'm trying to find what Robert found, but so far without success. Got it. I'll tread carefully. That evening, Elizabeth returned home feeling emotionally drained. The conversation with Martha had reopened old wounds, forcing her to remember everything she had gone through in her marriage to Robert. Passing by his study, she stopped. In 15 years of marriage, she had rarely entered the room. It was Robert's territory, where she was tacitly forbidden to go. But now, the door creaked as Elizabeth pushed it open. It was a neat office with bookshelves, a large oak desk, and a leather chair. Everything looked sterile and impersonal, just like Robert himself in public. Elizabeth began methodically checking the desk drawers and looking through folders with documents. Most of it was related to the sawmill, schedules, reports, estimates. Nothing unusual. Then she noticed the safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. A classic location, almost a cliché. Elizabeth never knew the combination, but she wondered what code Robert might have used. She tried their wedding date, no luck. His birthday, also no luck. Then she remembered how she had once overheard Robert refer to the day he got the job as manager of the sawmill as the best day of his life. When she entered that date, she heard a click. The safe door opened. Inside, she found a folder labeled Blue Ridge, Confidential. Opening it, Elizabeth saw an offer to buy the sawmill for a sum significantly higher than its actual value. The condition was that 60% of the staff would be laid off and the production facilities would be completely modernized. "My God," Elizabeth whispered. He was planning to sell the sawmill, knowing that most of the residents would lose their jobs. But even more surprising, in the same folder, she found a second document, an internal memo from the sawmill's CFO, Richard Clark, addressed to Robert. It mentioned serious discrepancies in the equipment purchase reports and requested an urgent meeting. Elizabeth sat in her bedroom, rereading the memo from Financial Director Richard Clark over and over again. Something didn't sit right with her. Clark had requested an urgent meeting with Robert on the very day he died. Coincidence? Hardly. After a restless night, Elizabeth decided to take action. She called Daniel Price and arranged a meeting, not at a cafe as usual, but at the old boathouse, away from the prying eyes of Maplewood. "We need to talk," she said, looking at her reflection in the mirror. "About Robert and what happened at the sawmill." Tuesday morning, a week before Robert Campbell's death, the Maplewood timber sawmill was buzzing with activity. Robert arrived early, as usual, tall, fit, wearing his usual suit and tie. In his office, the first thing he did was open the spreadsheet he had been looking at for the past few days. Numbers, expense columns, totals. At first glance, everything looked correct. But something bothered him. There was a knock at the door, and Daniel Price entered. "Good morning, Robert. You asked me to remind you about the meeting with Blue Ridge on Thursday." "Yes, thank you," Robert replied absent-mindedly. "Dan, take a look at this. It's the report on the purchase of new sawing equipment in March." Daniel looked at the screen over Robert's shoulder. "What exactly is bothering you?" "This amount," Robert pointed to one of the figures. $500,000 for equipment that usually costs around $300,000, and I haven't seen it installed. "Maybe there's a delay with the supplier," Daniel shrugged. 3 months late, and we paid the full amount up front? That's not our usual practice." Daniel suggested checking with Richard Clark, whose department handled the purchase, but Robert declined. "I'll talk to him myself, and I need to check the warehouse." "Why?" Daniel asked too quickly. Robert looked closely at his assistant. "I just want to make sure everything is in order." That evening, at the Campbells' home, Elizabeth was setting the table when Robert entered. "Hard day?" she asked, trying to sound sympathetic. "You could say that," Robert said, taking off his jacket. "Elizabeth, we need to talk. About the sawmill." "What exactly?" "I've found some discrepancies. In the financial reports, large sums of money are disappearing into thin air through purchases of equipment that doesn't exist." Elizabeth slowly put the plate on the table. "Are you sure?" "More than sure." Robert sat down at the table. "Someone in the sawmill's management is running a major fraud operation, and I suspect it's Daniel." "Daniel?" Elizabeth asked, alarm flashing in her voice. "He's your protege." "That makes it even worse. I'm going to talk to Jim Hawthorne. This is serious business. It could lead to an arrest." "And when do you plan to do that?" "Tomorrow. First, I want to gather all the evidence." Robert looked intently at his wife. "Elizabeth, are you okay? You look pale." "Just surprised," she replied quickly. "I never thought Daniel was capable of such a thing." As soon as Robert left his office, Elizabeth took out her phone and quickly typed a message. "We need to talk urgently. R knows everything. He's going to the sheriff tomorrow." Late that evening, Elizabeth met Daniel Price in a park on the outskirts of Maplewood. "What do you mean Robert knows everything?" Daniel asked tensely. "Exactly what I wrote," Elizabeth replied calmly. "He found discrepancies in the financial statements. He knows about the fictitious purchases, and he suspects you." "Damn." Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "How much does he know?" "Enough to go to the sheriff, and enough to bring us down." A heavy silence hung between them. Finally, Daniel said, "What do you suggest?" Elizabeth met his gaze. "You know what? We have no choice." "Liz, you're talking about—" "I'm talking about the fact that if Robert goes to the sheriff, you won't be the only one behind bars. I will be too," she said firmly. Daniel looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "All right, I'll do it, but you have to make sure you have an alibi." "That's no problem," Elizabeth smiled slightly. "I'll be a heartbroken widow. Robert always said I could be an actress." Monday morning, the day Robert Campbell died. Robert arrived at the sawmill earlier than usual. At 6:30 a.m., he went straight to the financial director's office. Richard Clark was already there, looking through papers. "Richard," Robert began without preamble, "I got your note. What do you mean? Serious discrepancies." Clark looked nervous. "Bob, I've been checking the reports on the latest equipment purchases and found some discrepancies. Large sums are listed as spent, but there is no proof of delivery. And some contracts have been signed, but there are no copies in our system." "Who signed them?" "Formally, you did, but I have my doubts." "I didn't sign anything," Robert said sharply. "Who has access to these documents?" "You, me, Daniel, and a couple of people in accounting, but they only enter data. They don't make decisions." Robert nodded grimly. "I'm going to talk to the sheriff today. This is more serious than I thought." "Bob, be careful," Richard said quietly. "If it's who I think it is." "Who?" Robert asked bluntly, but Richard shook his head. "First, I need to gather more evidence. Until I meet with the sheriff, I'll keep it to myself. Just be careful." 9:30 a.m. Robert was on his way to the sawmill. He was passing the main saw when he heard footsteps behind him. "Just checking to see if everything's ready for the shift," Daniel Price said. Robert turned around. "Actually, I was looking for that new equipment we supposedly installed in March." "Supposedly?" Daniel repeated. "Interesting choice of words." "Yes, supposedly," Robert said firmly. "Because it's not here. Neither is several other pieces of equipment we paid for. I'm trying to figure out where that money went." "And what are your conclusions?" "Fraud," Robert replied bluntly. "Someone forged documents and embezzled money, and I intend to find out who." "And what are you going to do about it?" "I've already made an appointment with Sheriff Hawthorne this afternoon." Daniel stared at Robert for a long time, then said slowly, "You're leaving me no choice, Bob." Robert frowned. "What are you talking about?" "That some secrets are better left buried, just like the people who dig them up." Robert took a step back, realizing the danger. "Do you understand what you're doing? You could go to prison for fraud, but for murder." "Murder? Who's talking about murder?" Daniel smiled. "It'll be an accident. The sawmill manager, working alone in the shop, accidentally disabled the safety mechanisms." Robert turned to the machine and saw that the safety guards had already been removed. "You won't get away with this," he said, looking around for an exit. "People know I found something." "Who? Richard? He's scared of his own shadow. Jim Hawthorne? You haven't had a chance to talk to him yet." "Elizabeth knows." A smile flashed across Daniel's face. "You think she's on your side? Poor, naive Bob." Robert froze. "What do you mean?" "I don't think you fully understand your wife," Daniel said. "She knows everything. She has from the beginning." "You're lying," Robert shook his head. "She would never betray you? Never want to get rid of a husband who humiliated her for years, controlled her every move, prevented her from growing?" Daniel took a step forward. Your wife hates you, Bob, and she can't wait to get her $500,000. Robert's face contorted in shock. He rushed toward the exit but tripped over a piece of debris on the floor. As he fell, he hit his head on the metal edge of the machine. Stunned, he tried to get up when he felt someone grab him and drag him toward the running machine. "Goodbye, Bob. Elizabeth says hi." The last thing Robert Campbell heard was the sound of the machine starting up. Present day. Sheriff James Hawthorne was studying documents seized from the sawmill office by warrant. Financial statements, equipment purchase contracts, bank statements. Everything pointed to systematic fraud. Over the past year, about $2 million had passed through this scheme. There was a knock at the door, and Deputy Donovan entered the office. "Boss, I have the results of the second examination of Campbell's body." And? It wasn't an accident. Campbell's head shows signs of trauma sustained prior to contact with the saw, a blow with a blunt object. We also found fabric particles that don't belong to Campbell's clothing. Someone else was there with him. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "So it's murder, just as I suspected. Do you have a suspect?" "Possibly," Hawthorne said, pointing to the documents. "Someone at the sawmill was running a major scam, and Robert found out about it. From what we can tell, he was going to expose the criminal. And he was killed to keep him quiet," Donovan finished. "Exactly," Hawthorne said, standing up and putting on his jacket. "Time to pay a visit to the sawmill, and I think we need to talk to the financial director, Richard Clark. Judging by the note Elizabeth found, he also discovered discrepancies." Elizabeth Campbell couldn't sleep. The events of the last few days had made her nervous, although outwardly she maintained the appearance of a disconsolate widow. A soft knock on the back door took her by surprise. Richard Clark, the sawmill's financial director, was standing on the threshold. "Mrs. Campbell," he began nervously. "I'm sorry to visit you so late, but I need to talk to you. It's about Robert." "Come in," Elizabeth said, opening the door wider, though she tensed inwardly. "I'm just making tea." Richard looked exhausted and frightened. "Elizabeth, I think I know who killed your husband." Elizabeth tried to keep her voice steady. "Are you sure it was murder?" "I'm sure," Richard nodded. "Robert discovered financial irregularities at the sawmill. Large sums of money were disappearing through fictitious equipment purchases. He came to me that morning before he was killed. He said he was going to talk to the sheriff." "Who was behind these shenanigans?" Elizabeth asked, already knowing the answer. "Daniel Price. And he wasn't working alone. With whom?" "Representatives of the Blue Ridge Group. You see, the plan was to artificially lower the value of the sawmill through financial manipulation and then sell it to Blue Ridge at a supposed market price that was actually much lower than its real value." "And Robert knew about this?" "Not right away." Richard shook his head. "At first, he just noticed discrepancies in the reports. But the more he dug, the more he understood the scale of the scam. And that's why Daniel killed him?" Elizabeth said it as a question, hiding her involvement. "I think so," Richard said quietly. "I don't have any direct evidence, but that morning I saw Daniel heading to the workshop shortly after Robert, and he's the only one who had both a motive and the opportunity." "Why are you telling me this and not the sheriff?" "I'm afraid," Richard admitted honestly. "Daniel's not someone you want to mess with, and I'm not sure the sheriff has enough evidence." After Clark left, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of panic. The investigation was nearing a breakthrough. She picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Daniel, we have a problem. Richard knows more than we thought. Are you sure he doesn't suspect you're involved?" "Absolutely. He thinks you were acting alone or with Blue Ridge." "Good. I'll take care of him. You keep playing the role of the inconsolable widow and report this visit to the sheriff. It'll look natural." Hanging up the phone, Elizabeth walked over to the mirror. Then she took a deep breath and let the tears well up in her eyes, the perfect mask for the upcoming conversation with the sheriff. The morning fog had not yet lifted over Maplewood when Sheriff James Hawthorne and his 3 deputies pulled up to Richard Clark's house. "Strange that he's not answering the door," Hawthorne muttered as he climbed the steps, "especially after he promised Elizabeth he'd meet with me this morning." After several unsuccessful knocks and rings, Hawthorne signaled to his deputies. A minute later, the door opened and the sheriff entered the house. Richard Clark was sitting at the kitchen table, his head resting on his hands as if he had fallen asleep. Only a pool of blood on the floor indicated that the sawmill's financial director would never wake up again. "Damn," Hawthorne said. "We're too late." The examination of the crime scene took several hours. There were no signs of a break-in, no obvious clues. Only one strange fact. On the table in front of Clark lay a folder with copies of the sawmill's financial documents, the very ones that confirmed the equipment fraud. "He wanted to give them to me," Hawthorne said to his deputy. "Someone found out and decided to stop him." "Just like Robert Campbell," Donovan added. "Exactly," the sheriff nodded. "Time to pay Daniel Price a visit." At the Campbell's house, Elizabeth paced nervously in the living room. Daniel's phone call had been brief. "It's done. Richard is no longer a problem." She understood what that meant and felt everything rapidly spiraling out of control. The plan was simple. Daniel would take care of Robert, she would get the insurance money, they would use the equipment scheme to get the money out, and then they would disappear from Maplewood. No one was supposed to die except Robert. But now the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Sheriff Hawthorne was standing on the doorstep. "Jim?" Elizabeth feigned relief. "Did you talk to Richard? Did he tell you about the scheme?" The sheriff's face was grim. "Elizabeth, I have some sad news to tell you. Richard Clark was found dead this morning. Murder." She didn't have to pretend to be shocked. She was genuinely shocked. Daniel hadn't said he was going to kill Clark. "My God, how did this happen?" "It looks like a professional job. No traces, no noise, but we found the documents he was preparing for me. Proof of financial fraud at the sawmill." Elizabeth sank into a chair. "You think he was killed because of that? Just like Robert?" "Everything points to it," Hawthorne nodded. "And I have reason to believe that one man is behind both murders, Daniel Price." "Daniel?" Elizabeth asked, trying to sound surprised. "But why would he do that?" "Money," the sheriff replied simply. "Over $2 million, siphoned off through fictitious equipment purchases, and the potential sale of the sawmill at a bargain price." Elizabeth was silent, thinking over the situation. The sheriff clearly knew nothing about her involvement. She could get out of this if... "My people are arresting Price right now," Hawthorne continued. "But there's something else that's bothering me." "What exactly?" "Richard mentioned that Daniel wasn't working alone. Someone was helping him from inside the sawmill or had access to financial documents." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you have any ideas?" "Not yet." The sheriff stood up. "But I'll find this man. Robert was my friend, and I won't rest until those responsible for his death are brought to justice." After the sheriff left, Elizabeth rushed to the phone, but then remembered that Daniel might already have been arrested. All she could do was wait and hope that he wouldn't mention her involvement. Daniel Price sat in the interrogation room, maintaining a calm exterior. Sheriff Hawthorne sat across from him. "Let's not waste any time," the sheriff began. "We have evidence of financial fraud, document forgery, and 2 murders. Everything points to you, Daniel." "That's absurd," Price replied calmly. "I was loyal to Robert and the sawmill. Why would I kill him?" "Because he found out you were stealing money from the company through fictitious purchases, and he was going to come to me." Daniel shrugged. "Proof?" "Fabric from your clothes at the murder scene. Surveillance footage showing you entering the workshop on the morning of Robert's death. A security guard who saw you leaving after Robert was already dead." Daniel's face twitched. "I want a lawyer." "Of course," Hawthorne nodded. "But before he arrives, think about this. We know you didn't act alone, and whoever helped you is still out there. Do you think that person will remain loyal to you when they realize you're trapped?" Fear flashed in Daniel's eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then let me tell you something interesting." The sheriff leaned closer. "I looked through Elizabeth Campbell's phone records for the last month. It's surprising how often you two talked, especially late at night." Daniel remained silent, but his gaze hardened. "And one more thing," Hawthorne continued. "On the night you killed Richard Clark, a gas station camera caught Elizabeth filling up her car 3 miles from his house, at 2 in the morning. Strange time and place for a widow, don't you think?" Daniel swallowed. "I want a lawyer. Right now." That evening, Elizabeth heard a knock at the door. Sheriff Hawthorne was standing there again, but this time he was accompanied by 2 deputies. "Elizabeth Campbell," Hawthorne said in an official tone, "you are under arrest on suspicion of complicity in the murders of Robert Campbell and Richard Clark." "What?" Elizabeth tried to look shocked. "Jim, are you out of your mind? I loved my husband." "Then explain why Daniel Price just testified against you. He told us everything, Liz, about your relationship, how you planned to get rid of Robert, your involvement in financial fraud." Elizabeth turned pale. "He's lying." "Maybe," the sheriff agreed. "But how do you explain the fact that you were near his house on the night of Clark's murder, or that after Robert's death, you withdrew $50,000 in cash from your account? Money we can't trace." She was silent, realizing the game was over. "You know what else Daniel said?" Hawthorne continued. "That the idea to kill Robert was yours, that you manipulated him, using his feelings for you." "That's not true," Elizabeth exclaimed, losing her composure. "It was his plan. He came up with the whole scheme with the equipment. He forged the documents. I just wanted freedom from Robert." Hawthorne shook his head. "Freedom at the cost of a man's life? Robert was my friend, Liz, and I always considered you a friend too." When the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of relief. The game of playing the inconsolable widow was over. 2 weeks later, the small town of Maplewood was slowly recovering from the shock. The story of the Black Widow Elizabeth Campbell and her murderous lover Daniel Price was the talk of the town. At a town meeting, the mayor announced that the sawmill would be sold, but not to the Blue Ridge Group, but to a local group of investors who promised to keep the jobs. The new management was headed by Martha Wolfe, Elizabeth's former friend. "I never suspected she was capable of that," Martha confessed to Sheriff Hawthorne after the meeting. "I knew she was unhappy with Robert, but murder—" "People often wear masks," Hawthorne replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes even those closest to them can't see the real face behind them." In the county jail, Elizabeth Campbell could see a patch of blue sky through the small window of her cell. It was the freedom she had so desperately sought, but she had chosen the wrong path to find it.